Hello, everyone. This is Eva Klein from the ABA Center on Children and the Law, and I want to welcome you to the second of our webinar series on domestic child sex trafficking. And this webinar is brought to you as part of a partnership with the Department of Children and Families in Connecticut and the Division of Public Defender Services, the Connecticut H.A.R.T Program, and the ABA Center on Children and the Law. And today, we're very pleased to bring you Leslie Jones as our speaker, who is going to address trauma-informed legal advocacy. So I don't know how familiar you all might be with the Adobe Connect platform that we're using today. So I just wanted to take a minute while we wait for others to join to familiarize you a little bit with the platform and some of the functions that you can use during this webinar. The most important, I think, is the chat function, which is down at the bottom. And in that chat box, you can add any questions that you want to ask. If you don't want to speak up, you can just type in your question and we'll be sure to address it as the webinar goes forward. You can also start chats with individual people who are listed as participants, and all you need to do is put your cursor over their name and it says Start Chat With, and those will become private chats that nobody else sees. Those disappear when we close out the room, and there is no record of them. So feel free to interact with your fellow participants in that way. I also want to point out that we are using a line that is separate from the computer, from the actual Adobe room. So we do ask you, if you're on the line, if you could please mute your phone, either with *6 when you're not speaking, or directly on your phone, whichever way works best for you. And then if you do want to ask a question, you can always unmute yourself with *6 as well. So those are some of the functions, and just so that I can get a sense of people, really knowing that they can ask those questions, I'm going to ask a real quick question. If you wouldn't mind putting into the chat what your role is, what department or agency you might be with, and what your role in that department or agency might be. And I see a few people are typing. Great. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Well, then I'm not going to spend any more time on these types of housekeeping things, and I'm going to move us right into our content. And I am just really pleased and excited to welcome Leslie Jones, who is the Director of Advocacy and Policy with the Office of the Public Defender in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. And Leslie's going to speak to us today about childhood trauma and trauma-informed legal advocacy. So I would like to just before I hand it over completely to Leslie, I just want to point out that on the very right, there are a couple web links to some videos that we will be showing you today, but you have those for you to also, peruse on your own time. And then also there are a list of resources where at the very bottom right, there's also a list of resources, many of which Leslie will be referring to, but you can also download all of those for reading later or, to save to your own computer to read as you can. So welcome to Leslie. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Eva, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for this opportunity to share what I have learned about trauma and its impact as it relates to my clients and my work in terms of representing them and also in terms of criminal justice reform. So I am with the Montgomery County Office of the Public Defender in Pennsylvania. We are a suburb outside of Philadelphia, and I have been practicing primarily defense attorney for 19 years now. I noticed someone said they were assigned counsel. I used to work in central New York and I was assigned counsel there. And so we had a law guardian. Well, we called it law guardian back then. Now it's attorney for the child, a law guardian office. And so I took the complex cases for delinquency matters and handled a few, not as many dependency cases, but primarily I do juvenile and adult criminal defense. So in my role now as the policy and advocacy director, what I've been doing is trying to figure out how to intersect what is going on in the kind of now global discourse around trauma and how that impacts the juvenile justice system and what we can do as advocates, as stakeholders, as decision makers to better understand and accommodate what this means for our clients and our systems. So I'm going to share some information that may be new to some of you, or maybe things that you've heard before, but hopefully in a fresh light. This is a challenging topic because we all respond differently to adversity, and at the same time, it impacts how we function as people, but also how we interact with each other in community. What is unfortunate, I think, from a legal perspective for a lot of people is that there are no clear lines with this. It's very complex. There are a lot of issues, and what I know from the law and my experience is that, we like to kind of have things clear cut, even though, of course, we always have that it depends. This is not clear cut, and we do have just a limited amount of time, so I'm hoping that in this presentation you'll be encouraged to take advantage of the resources that are outlined there in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, because those give you very detailed and helpful practice guidelines and recommendations, whether you represent children, whether you are working for your county or state, and whether or not you are helping to create policy, or whether you're having to adjust to what is available and try to make changes. I'm going to get us started with just talking about, and this is something I've learned through my trauma training, is that it's really great to kind of lay out what we're doing, but also to understand that everything we're saying here is we're preserving the confidentiality of the call, but also this is voluntary. I hope that everyone feels comfortable asking questions. If not in the chat, you can also ask me. You can interrupt. I'm okay with that. I like participatory back and forth. So feel free to say, "Hey, Leslie, wait a minute. What did you just say?" Or in the chat, Eva will bring up questions that need to be answered in the course of the presentation. Hopefully today we'll just go over briefly some brain and body basics. We'll talk about ACEs, both adverse childhood experiences and adverse community environments. And when we finish this, we'll be able to better recognize trauma and the impact of ACEs, but also to think more broadly about the role of resiliency and restorative justice. So, the thing that we have to understand, and actually let me just say one more piece about this before let me go back one and just say, in thinking about our goals and guidelines for today, I want to make it clear that trauma-informed care is all about accommodating, better understanding, accommodating, explaining what is happening with vulnerable populations. So we're not talking about treatment. There are evidence-based therapeutic and clinical and medical approaches that deal with actually, improving the quality of life with regard to specific symptoms, with higher functioning for youth and adults, and that sort of tangible healing work. What we're talking about today is how do we as juvenile justice stakeholders, whether we're, again, attorneys or judges, whether we're system advocates or lawmakers, how do we create and support trauma-informed court systems, trauma-informed juvenile justice systems? So we're going to really just be learning about trauma, understanding our need to ensure that the young people that we work with receive the appropriate treatment when necessary, and then also taking and learning about and doing our part around trauma-informed advocacy. How do we shape our work as advocates and as people who represent children? So I want to start just by reminding everyone that we more than likely have met our clients, met our stakeholders somewhere in the middle of their story, even if they're young. It's somewhere in the middle of their story, right? We don't know the whole story. And so we have to understand that as we're thinking about the role and impact of trauma in the lives of our clients, we have to also think about our own conceptual systems that we develop over time, which outline our expectations, not just for ourselves, but of everyone around us. And so our own individual assumptions form, belief systems that we have. And yes, this is definitely an individual sorting process, but we have to realize that that individual sorting process actually impacts how we do our work, what we think about. So that goes to our attitudes, our beliefs, our opinions, and our values. And so we're filtering all this information that we're receiving through these lenses, again, perceiving who we are and how the world around us impacts us. And that, of course, speaks to our own abilities to learn and grow and change and do things differently or maintain where we've been and how we've done it and what we expect, both, again, from ourselves and from others. So with that in mind, I just want to introduce you to this concept of the pair of aces tree. We're going to talk about this in more detail in a few minutes. But when we're thinking about trauma and we're thinking about domestic child trafficking or sexual trafficking, we really are talking about, we're really converging two things. And we're going to get into that, but I wanted to just give you this idea that when we make these associations, when we think about connecting one thing to another. And so we're going to talk more about what ACEs are and how adverse community environments impact them. But when you're, again, thinking about how incarceration is connected to domestic violence or how substance use is connected to homelessness, we are interpreting all of these things through our lenses. And we make beliefs and generalizations that lead us to conclusions about all of this. And so it's not just we as adults and practitioners who are doing that, it's also the young people that we're working with and their families. So when we're thinking about our associations, our interpretations, our generalizations, we are thinking about that through our own life experiences. We're thinking about that in relationship to how we deal with other people and what we expect from them. But we're also thinking about that in terms of safety and power. So when we are, delving into this but into this work around trafficking, power and relationships, safety and security play a very large role in how our clients think, how they act, and how they respond to what's going on around them and their part in that. So let's just talk really quickly about the brain. So I already mentioned I'm an attorney. I'm not a scientist, but I will say that this slide I like because it's very basic. The brain, right? I'm just breaking down this very complex system into three parts. That survival state, the brainstem, the kind of am I safe, am I secure, are all my needs being met? That emotional piece, or what they call the limbic system, just above that, where, talks more about connectivity, which again, when we talk about trafficking, there's a piece there about connectivity and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, who loves me, who doesn't, what is my environment telling me about my value, and what's expected of me and my potential in the world. And then, of course, there's the executive brain state, our prefrontal cortex, where we do our reasoning, where we, our reasonable person standard, right? And now we have our reasonable juvenile standard, that part of the brain that we can access to reason and think, and actually process. So what I want to do really quickly, Eva has a video, hopefully. Our primer on ACEs is just very short. I just think it's effective in breaking down ACEs very quickly, since we have a limited amount of time, and then we can breeze on in to some of the deeper dive. Okay. As Eva's pulling up the PowerPoint again, I just thought that was helpful, and I'm not sure, again, where everyone is in their information about ACEs. So I try not to make assumptions and use tools that are quick and thorough so that we can keep moving forward. The whole idea behind adverse childhood experiences is that we are thank you so much, is that we're understanding that this affects the developing brain. So we're talking about a young person's ability to interact with you as an adult, understand what you're saying to them, understand what's happening to them in the course of already a stressful situation. So when we're talking about the different ACEs that are happening, we're saying that these are situations in the life of a child before they're 18 years old that then have negative outcomes on their health and in terms of behavior as they grow into adults. So a lot of the things that you see now around, alcoholism, drug use, suicide attempts, that's something that the ACEs study followed for people in adulthood. This predominantly middle class, white community, median incomes that were, jobs that had health insurance, median incomes that were relatively comfortable in comparison to the families for some of our clients and some of the communities that they come from. And even with all of that, you had these very high numbers. 2/3 of that population had at least one ACE. So these outcomes are what they marked and tracked for adults. And what we're understanding is that when we're dealing with children coming from these communities that are under-resourced, and we're going to talk about adverse community environments in a second, we're seeing these things a lot earlier, and that's impacting their ability to be a part of their representation. It's impacting our ability as the adults responsible for zealous advocacy and for protecting and providing for them as it relates to these justice systems. It makes our relationships, it impacts our relationships and our ability to both advise them, but also to even, in some cases, understand what would be best to meet their needs. So when we're thinking about needs, there's a model that has been around for many years, and that a lot of social scientists are very familiar with, where we understand that at the center of a child, there are these the basic needs that need to be met that come through most time. It comes through the family. It comes through schools. It comes through their peer support. Things that they communities that they develop and grow into over time. And then there are the systems outside of that are more community-based in their neighborhoods, environments that come through their faith-based communities, through media. And we know now that when we're looking at this exosystem, the media impact, especially when we're talking about trafficking, the media impact is very significant, much more so than when I was their age. So when we are thinking about children, we're not just looking at this individual person inside a bubble. There are these external forces that play a very large role in how they see the world, going back to those lenses, how they are forming their own attitudes and beliefs, how they're interpreting the world around them. And then, of course, the macro system, which includes all of us, the laws, the culture, the history, the social conditions. And so this picture gives a very, it gives a very supportive look, or very supportive version of what it's like for a young person in today's world, that they have these circles of support around them that are designed to help them grow, to help them reach their potential, to help them become the people that they're supposed to be, our future policymakers, our future engineers, our future surgeons, our future, adults who have the cure for cancer, like whatever it is that they're meant to do. But that's one way to look at it. And that's, and what we're doing and what we're learning about with trauma is that we have to incorporate what's really happening in the lives of our young people and in their communities in how we represent them, how we tell their stories, how we bring not just the facts of the case in front of us or the circumstances in child welfare situations, not just the facts of the circumstances that brought us into this justice system, but everything else that goes on around them that contributes to that, because that is where, and that is what influences, and that's what impacts what our clients are seeing and how they're responding. So, to get into what trauma impacted living looks like, this is actually some information I love to share, because when I found out about it, it explained so much to me. So we're talking about stress and traumatic stress. So there's trauma, and then there's responses to things that happen to people. And so I'm bringing that up because we're going to talk a little bit more about the responses to traumatic stress, but I want us to understand what is actually going on in the brain. This is not a matter of opinion. This is not a matter of subjective thinking. This is science. This is saying that when you encounter a stress that overwhelms you, there is a response. There is a physiological response, responses even that happen to you, where you are now, your neural state is triggered, right? And so now you are releasing adrenal steroids, growth hormones. You can say amino acids and other stress-mediating chemicals that are producing this allostatic load in your body. That continues to impact you even when the stress is no longer present, when you are always subjected to the circumstances that lead to exposed traumatic experiences, chronic traumatic experiences. And so I'm saying this because when we're thinking about who our clients are and their ability to work with us, we have to keep this in mind. It's not just the stress that happens in the moment and at the event. It's the fact that when a young person is constantly experiencing or is exposed to circumstances that are beyond their control and that overwhelm them, they are living in a state that they are going to be more reactive and reflexive. When we think about why we think how we think, this chart that Bruce Perry, this is Bruce Perry's work, where we are in our brain stem, our sense of timing is very short. We're not forward thinking. Not only is our heart rate up and our IQ lowered in the situation, we have lost our ability to kind of see consequences, to see the future, to understand that what I'm doing right now is going to have impact in the future. And so when we are thinking about children in a trafficking situation, it's likely that they're going to experience difficulties with recognizing, expressing, and understanding even what their emotions are. Their ability to calm down and to use that prefrontal cortex, that's not going to happen if we're not offering them the kind of regulation activities or the kind of time that it takes to get their brain out of a terror state back into a calm state. Because it's only in the calm state that they could even understand what you're saying when you're saying it to them. So when you have a child who has been, who is actively in a fearful place, which a lot of our justice system environments can lead to that kind of response in children, whether you're talking about a child that's in foster care, whether you're talking about a detained child, someone who is facing a judge and doesn't really understand what's happening to them or what this is going to look like long term, if they could even think that way, you are going to have to think about that as it relates to your practice your ability to relate to children, to develop some semblance of trust, because in some instances we only have a few minutes to do that, that they have been disappointed by adults in the past, so it's not necessarily that they're going to, trust you or think that you're going to be any different. Where you talk to your clients, how you talk to your clients, your ability to really explain to them in a way that they can understand despite what brain state they're in, what's happening, all of those things are critical. So they're critical not just in terms of our ability to maintain a trauma-informed space, they're also critical in understanding how we relate to someone who's trauma impacted and how we represent them and how we build a relationship with them so that we can get the best outcome no matter what we're doing on their behalf for them. I'm going to move on to one other aspect of this, and this is the other side of the ACEs coin for the work that I do. And that's understanding, again, that there's a community component to this. We're not just looking at this from our client's perspective, just that inner circle, just the level that says it's just this young person, his or her actions and the resulting consequences. It's recognizing that our clients come from communities in many cases that are also trauma impacted. This is just one example. It's a lawsuit that is active right now in California against the Compton Unified School District. And I'm sorry I don't have like an overlay. I'm still working on that with my artistic skills. But what I am trying to show here is that on the left side, you have a map of the schools in the Compton Unified School District. And on the right side, you have a map of the homicides. That is the homicides from in that same neighborhood for that particular time period. It's an overlay. So where those schools are located, where those young people go to school, where the teachers teach, and everyone else that's involved in the district, in that community is a culture that includes not just homicides, because, gun violence has many, many, many collateral consequences. So, whether we're talking about substance use, whether you're talking about just, and this is homicide, so this isn't, burglary or robbery or injury that just comes from gun violence and the use of guns. In that case, this circle would be a lot darker. So when we're thinking again about where our young people, especially in the area of trafficking, where they're coming from, where they live, who they interact with, we have to keep in mind that all of these aspects play a role. Again, not just in terms of the case in front of them, but in our role as advocates and as mentors and as people who have the ability to support them and offer better outcomes. So, bringing all those things together, the slide before, I'll just go back. When we're looking at this trauma-impacted living from an individual perspective, and we think about trauma traditionally as this kind of individual medical model, that there's this personal piece to it that, of course, exists, but at the same time, recognizing that there's also a community component here, that it's not just the increased adrenaline and increased cortisol and everything going on in your brain. It's also the environment that you find yourself in that keeps you in a state of insecurity. And so when you pull all these things together, going back to that pair of ACEs tree, we're understanding that it's not just as the ACEs study showed in 1998, it's not just the 10 factors that are the leaves of the tree that we can determine the health of the community. It's not just what we see on the surface, that there's also these root causes, that in the soil underneath that tree are systemic issues that also contribute to the level of stability or lack thereof in our clients' lives. And when we're talking about trafficking in particular, this is very important because what we find is that young people who have been in abusive relationships tend to be more willing, for example, to sell sex for survival. And survival is what we're talking about, not just survival in terms of health and wellness, which is, of course, a huge piece, but survival in terms of understanding who you are in the world and what you're capable of and what the world expects of you and what you can expect back from them, going back to those lenses. So when we're thinking about discrimination or housing insecurity, for example, and we're thinking about substandard housing, there are just now more studies coming out about the connection between neurotoxicity and aggressive behavior in young people. So where you have a situation like here in Philadelphia, lead paint is still an issue. That lead paint issue then manifests itself later in aggressive behavior in children. That aggressive behavior in school, which can lead to disciplinary actions, are then what lands young people into the justice system. At the same time, from a trafficking perspective, where there is housing insecurity because of poverty issues, then you're looking at how are basic needs getting met in a community that is marked by not just the stress and the violence, but also poorly resourced schools, health care that's not accessible. All of these things factor into what we're seeing in our clients and the stories that they're bringing to the table. So we're going to just check out one more film, one more short piece that is, I think, really significant in bringing together some of these things that I've been talking to you about in a way that gives you kind of a visual, because I think visual helps. We're going to just see a portion of this, and I encourage you to go to the website. It's rememberingtrauma.org. There's actually 2 videos there. We're going to see a part of the first one. The second one has experts talking about the science, the brain science, and the treatment modalities that are available. So, Eva, we're going to just see one. And I think she has it queued up for us. So okay.
I do. Great.
Thank you so much, Eva, for that. I want to just pull some of this together before we start talking about poly-victimization and domestic child sex trafficking and why all of this matters. There's another scene there we're cutting off that Manny is now back in his adult state, and he's with his, I call him a probation officer, and he's trying to explain himself because the probation is saying, well, why did you do what you did? And you'll have to see the whole video for the whole story. And his first thing is, he doesn't know, and he's tried to get help, and it hasn't helped. And I'm bringing that up because when we talk about the impact of trauma, I look at ACEs as rocks, right? Rocks that are in that come from the community, that come from your upbringing, that come from situations you were born into and situations that you find yourself in that you grow into as a result of your circumstances. And so if we visualize, and I usually do this in person with people, but if you visualize the backpack, and that when Manny was born in that video, we saw several different things going on in his house. It's my assertion that when he was born, his parents gave him a backpack. And in that backpack were their own rocks, their own ACEs, their own, if you go back to the pair of ACEs tree, whatever happened in their lives around maybe divorce or abuse and neglect or substance use or mental illness. When he was born, he got a backpack. And then as he lives, as he moves forward in his life, we saw victimization there, be it from violence in the home or violence in the community, and then how that expresses itself when he's at school. So now he's collecting his own rocks and his own backpack. And then now he has his child, because in the very start of that, you saw that he was coming home in a situation that clearly he had been in some kind of altercation. And he has his own child, his own son now. And so when that child is born, he's not just getting his father's backpack, he's getting his grandparents' backpack as well. And those are backpacks you can't see. I have a backpack, and I'm making an assumption here that several of you have backpacks, and we don't see those backpacks, and some of us don't even realize we're carrying them. So I'm just bringing that up because as we talk about, as you continue in the series around domestic child sex trafficking, we're thinking about, the ways in which these young people have been impacted, not just in their families, but also through their communities. We're looking at the fact that for many youth, victimization rarely occurs in just one way or in just one instance. So I like that video because it shows you that as an adult, there are these things that happened in his life, multiple victimizations that happen that brings him where he is. And the same can be true of any young person that you see through trafficking. And so we have a quick poll. I know we're getting short on time, but we just have a little bit of interaction. We're going to just take a poll to see how ACEs, what you think ACEs looks like in adults. And so the first question is, children having 4 or more ACEs are up to 12 times more likely to struggle with depression, suicide attempts, alcoholism, and drug abuse as adults. It's just a quick true or false, if you're still with me. So it looks like most people understand that this is a true statement. We're recognizing through this study of trauma and understanding more that when you're exposed to family and community violence or any other indirect form of victimization that's linked to that, when you think about that circle around that school district, that mental health issues, whether it's depression or low self-esteem, that impacts academic performance and social functioning in school and in other arenas, and that there's also emotional effects to all of this, right? Panic attacks and panic disorders, substance use and eating disorders, all things, again, that you find when you're looking at vulnerable populations, particularly in a trafficking environment, that children who are exposed to repeated interpersonal forms of traumatic experiences have symptoms very much like PTSD. So we saw in that video, that very short clip, flashbacks. He's flashing back to his time as a child when these things happened to him, and he may not even be understanding that. Other things like avoidance, where you don't want to talk about what's happening, and so you have a client who's experienced some severe traumatic experiences as a child, who hasn't learned how to negotiate that, is now brought to you for something minor. Maybe you have a client that has we call it petty larceny or retail theft or something that seems simple on the surface, but they're not willing to talk to you about it because we don't know what in that experience may have triggered something that brought something back for them that they either haven't had any professional help to deal with or never even recognized it as an issue because it was something that happened so pervasively in their childhood that it was just normalized for them. Other things like numbing, where you have a limited range of emotions for kids, so where you think, oh, this is something that should upset them or this is something that should calm them, and the actual opposite happens. These are all things to consider when you're working with this population. So it's arousal is one piece, trust issues is another, but all of those things go into who that young person is in front of you and what they're bringing to the table. So we're going to go to our quick next poll question. I'm keeping you hopefully engaged as we get to the end of this. That youth impacted by trauma may have trouble with processing or receiving the information that you're giving them. Because if they're primarily focused on survival, they may miss what you're even saying. They may not understand it. So if you look at this poll question really quick and just answer if you think that's true or false, that in some instances it's not that our clients or the young people that we work with are defiant or don't want to participate or cooperate. Sometimes, again, going back to that chart, they're not able to access that part of their brain that lets them focus, that lets them engage, that lets them participate. So really quick, it looks like we all got the right answer. True. These are meant to be easy questions so that you feel confident and comfortable moving forward. And recognizing that, again, environmental stressors play a part. So when you have a child in foster care, if you have a child that's dealing with issues around housing insecurity, you're going to find that these are even more elevated stress levels, more of a sense of insecurity, a lack of safety, more trust issues, more things that are happening to them, more responses that you may not anticipate. Our third poll question, I just wanted to bring this into the conversation because, again, when we're thinking about trafficking, less than 4% of all adolescents exchange sex for money. However, 28% of youth living on the street and 10% of those in shelters engage in survival sex for food, shelter, or money. So again, when you're trying to get your basic needs met and you can't access that part of your brain that's long-term, you've either just operating in minutes and seconds or even have lost all sense of time, you are focused on how am I going to survive, maybe not even tonight, maybe just right now. How am I going to make it through this next hour, through this next day? Hopefully thinking more forward, but not necessarily able to. You are going to use the tools that you have, as some kids would tell me, to get what you need to get. And so again, that's a true statement. And then our next poll, almost final poll question is, again, youth who have already been a victim of abuse, is it more likely that they are going to exchange sex for shelter, food, or other basic needs? So anybody willing to answer that? So as we get towards the end in our quick Q&A, I just want to make sure we understand, though, that while a lot of court-involved youth are likely to have experienced trauma, a majority of them are likely to have experienced it, and to exhibit traumatic stress symptoms as a result, we have to remember that not all reactions or responses to adversity are the same, and that some children, even though they have been through a lot, are not necessarily going to have had what we consider a traumatic response to it. And so I just want to end on thinking about resiliency and restorative justice, and this whole idea that there is, aces are not destiny, as the video said earlier, that even where you have hard things going on in your life, where you have access to resources, where you have a community that supports you, you're able to overcome some of that stuff in your backpack. No, it's not a magic wand that moves everything to the side or makes everything better. But we as adults in these young people's lives have the capacity through our representation, whatever that looks like, to support them and to offer something that understands and accommodates what they've been through and what they need to get past that. So I'll just close out with this last slide and our last poll question around what we can do with stakeholders and understanding, and I throw restorative justice in there as something that I'm very much a part of in my local jurisdiction, but what I believe to be true and how trauma can help us change the systems that we have to make them more accommodating and more empathetic and more effective, is understanding that everyone doesn't need the same thing. And I think that that's what the challenge is for us as juvenile justice stakeholders, that we're used to kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to our work. Trauma says that we have to do things differently and we have to accommodate people's particular needs. So in thinking about what that looks like, I thought that this final image just gives you an understanding that though we all have different needs, in the end, we all can get where we need to be if we work together to do so. Thank you for your time and attention and for understanding that all of the above, we're all responsible and in all these ways can help make the system better and offer better outcomes for our young people.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I do want to give people an opportunity with these last few minutes that we have to either type a question for Leslie into the chat or to speak up and ask. If there's anything that caught your attention while she was speaking that you'd like to delve into a little further or clarify, now's your chance. Okay, and if you don't have any questions, still feel free to type them into the chat while I'm talking, or contact Leslie directly afterwards. And Leslie, I don't know if you would be willing to type your email address into the chat so folks could have that. If that would be a possibility, that would be great. Thank you. So as you are leaving, if I could just ask you to please answer these 3 quick poll questions that we have on the left. It's really helpful to us and helps us, identify what's going well and what isn't. And I want to also, as you do that, remind you. Thank you, Leslie. I see she did put her email there. So anybody who would like to follow up with Leslie can do that with that email address. But I would also like to draw your attention to the pod at the left, which has all the trauma-informed resources. And I'm actually going to add to that left the web links to the videos that were shown earlier. Put that right over there with the other resources. And I'm going to leave this room up for a while after this session, and you can feel free to come back and pull down those resources, download any files that you think might be helpful to you in your work, or the links to the videos. And so one last chance for any questions that someone might have. But barring that, I just want to thank you for your attention and your participation. And I want to make sure you remember that we will have 2 more webinars in the series, one on judicial responses to runaway youth and youth missing from care. That's on September 11th at 1 p.m. And then one on juvenile defenders representing victims of sex trafficking. And that will be on September 25th, 1 p.m. as well. So thank you so much.